The previous two lessons were specifically designed for members of the church, for you guys, for things we're doing here. This is a presentation, frankly, I think it's the most important presentation in our whole series. I try to make sure I do this every time I speak to atheists, every time I speak on neutral ground, which is most of the time, auditoriums, college lectureships, college auditoriums, motel meeting rooms, and so forth. Because I think it's such an important area. And so if I come across treating you as atheists this morning, understand this is a presentation that I use when I'm dealing with the public. And a couple of you had asked me to do a couple of those, both today and Friday. I'm going to do that. Friday we'll be talking about which God, why Jesus Christ, why not Muhammad, why not Buddha, why not Zoroaster, why not Baha'u'llah. May I ask you if you're a member of the church, why? Is it because mom and dad were believers, they were members, grandma and grandpa were members? You know, if that's the only reason that you were a member of the church, then if you were born in Iraq, you'd be a Muslim, wouldn't you? So I want to talk about that on Friday. But today, I want to talk about what is God. I'm going to push you to think this morning. As I said, I know that's not always popular, but I think it's important to understand that this is probably the most important question that our world faces today. And I think you'll see that as we go along. Science and faith are compatible. They support each other. They reinforce each other. And that is so clearly shown in this discussion. I have never known an atheist who knew what God is. Now be careful. I didn't say who God is. I said what God is. And you say, well, that's weird. You were an atheist. That's right. Madeline did not understand what God is. My father did not understand what God is. I did not understand what God is. I've never known an agnostic that had a working, functional, logical understanding of what we mean by this thing that we call God. As a matter of fact, I've met very few Christians. When you really get right down to it, that understand what we're talking about when we talk about this thing that we call God. When I say God to you this morning, what do you visualize? Or do you visualize anything? When you pray to God, what do you pray to? Is it something that maybe looks a little bit like this? You know, the last course I took in my graduate work at Notre Dame University was taught by an atheist, and he began the class by saying, now we all know what God is. God is an old man in the sky with a long white beard and big white flowing robes. And that was honestly and sincerely the man's concept of God. To what extent is that your concept of God? Because you see, we all do that. We all do that. We want a God that's like us. We want a God that likes what we like, doesn't like what we don't like, that has the same problems and the same prejudices and the same hang-ups that we have. And so we have a tendency to create God in our own image. And we ask questions that demonstrate we don't have the foggiest idea what God is. I hear these questions every weekend on university and college campuses all across this country. Questions like, what color of skin does God have? Questions like, what sex is God? Questions like, how can God hear my prayer and the prayer of the little boy in China at the same time? Questions like, who created God? Where did God come from? Questions like, why does God allow? And you fill in the blank. Cancer, as we just said, shared with us. Hitler. War. Drought. See, all of those questions are rooted in a fundamental inability to understand what God is. And I don't have any trouble understanding why Church of Christ people have problems here. You know where I got that picture? Off the front page is some Church of Christ Bible School literature for 3-year-olds. See, many of us were indoctrinated at a very early age with a completely fallacious concept of God. But we see it everywhere. This is the cover of Scientific American. The article was about creationism. But what's the concept? And that picture occurs over and over. You say, well, it's a very famous work of art. I understand that, but that doesn't mean the artist had any notion about what he was doing. When you look at pop literature, what does that conjure up in your mind? See, we have all of these things projected to us in this area. And I mentioned the atheist literature. I mentioned this particular poster, which is all over the country. And you say, well, that's symbolic. Well, okay, maybe it's symbolic, but the question is, symbol of what? See, what I'm saying to you is that if your concept of God is in any way, shape, or form along the lines of what I've been showing you on the screen in the last few minutes, not only is your concept illogical, not only is it irrational, not only is it beyond any reasonable defense whatsoever, but it is completely and totally alien to what the Bible teaches. I want to try something different to most of you this morning. I want to tell you a little story, a little fairy tale. This little fairy tale you probably heard before, maybe in some other area. It was written in the last century by a man by the name of Edwin Abbott, and it was called Flatland. Flatland was written for the purposes I'm using it for this morning. You may have heard it in a topography class or a political science class, but it was written for what we're doing here today. Flatland's a story of a man who lives in a two-dimensional world. Now, what I mean by that is he lives in a world that's like this sheet of paper. This sheet of paper has only two dimensions, at least in the surface of it. It has length and it has width. In the surface of it, at least, it has no thickness. I, on the other hand, am a three-dimensional being. I have length and I have width and I have considerable thickness. And it's the thickness dimension that separates me from Flatland. You cannot get me, a three-dimensional being, into a two-dimensional sheet of paper. You can't get me in the paper. Now you can draw a front view of me. We have a name for that. We call it a portrait. But a portrait's not the whole me. It's just one view of me. You can draw a side view of me. The man in Flatland is shown in the story as a profile. But a profile is not the whole me. It's just one view of me. You can draw a back view of me. You can draw a top view of me, which in my case is 4 concentric circles. You got that? What do you see when you look at me from up there? Bald spot, head, shoulders, belly, 4 circles. But 4 circles isn't all there is to me. It's just the view of me from up there. You cannot get me, a three-dimensional being, into a two-dimensional sheet of paper. Can't be done. Now, in the story of Flatland, the man who lives in Flatland, in a world that holds only length and width, is visited one day by a sphere. A ball. A ball has 3 dimensions. It has an X and a Y and a Z axis. And it just so happens in the story that the sphere crosses Flatland right in the living room of the hero of the story. So what happens when the sphere touches Flatland? Well, what happens is that in Flatland, a dot appears on this guy's floor out of nothing. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, just think about it. If I took this tennis ball, dipped it in a bucket of red paint, and touched it to the paper, what would happen where the ball touches the paper? Yeah, there'd be a spot. Or if you like to say things mathematically, when a sphere is tangent to a plane, there's a point at the intersection. But understand something. A dot in Flatland is matter. This guy is made of a series of dots. That's what a line is. So matter has spontaneously been created out of nothing. A miracle has occurred. And as he watches in amazement, the dot becomes a circle. See, what has happened is that the sphere has dumped deeper into Flatland. If I took a slice out of this tennis ball, what would I have? I'd have a circle, wouldn't I? Or again, if you like to say things mathematically, when a sphere is truncated by a plane, there's a circle at the intersection. But understand something, a circle is bigger than a dot. It takes lots of dots to make a circle. So matter is spontaneously being created out of nothing. Everything the man in Flatland knows to be true scientifically is not working. And as the sphere sinks deeper and deeper into Flatland, the circle gets larger and larger until it's about to crowd the guy right out of his own living room. He gets over to the door, ready to run out of the room, and just as he gets to the door, the sphere reaches its equator, passes its equator. So what happens to the size of the circle? But that's another violation of the laws of science. Matter energy cannot be created nor destroyed. But he sees it happening. And he walks back into the room as the circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller, until finally it's just a dot, and then it completely disappears as the sphere leaves Flatland. The man in Flatland doesn't believe in ghosts, but he just saw one. Now as the story goes on, the man in Flatland starts to talk to the sphere, and the sphere talks back. That's a weird experience. The sound waves come up through Flatland, so this voice comes from all around him and even inside of him. But he adjusts. And the man in Flatland says to the sphere, tell me something. What's it like to be a sphere? Well, the sphere thinks he knows how to do this. So he says to the man in Flatland, all right, here's what I want you to do. I want you to draw a circle on your floor. By the way, here's a little graphic showing you what we have been discussing so far. The top is what he sees, the bottom is what's happening. So he says, draw a circle on your floor. That's not easy. Oh, it is for you and I. We're three-dimensional. We take a piece of paper to go like that. But to the man who lives in Flatland, a circle is a constantly curving line that comes back where it starts. And he's never seen a whole circle at one time, because this side of the circle prevents him from seeing this side. The only way the man in Flatland could ever see a whole circle would be to be in the middle of it. Then he could look all directions. But if he ever got in the middle of it, he could never get out. People in Flatland commit suicide by drawing circles around themselves. Because they can't get out of it. You understand that? Somebody's saying yes, somebody's saying what? Let me give you a three-dimensional illustration. Suppose I had a 12-foot steel ball up here. No windows, no doors. Foot-thick walls. And somehow you get in the center. Could you ever get out? That's three-dimensional. So it takes the man hours to draw the circle. He has to get survey equipment out, but finally the circle is drawn. And the sphere says, boy, whew, I'm glad you finally got that done. Now here's what I want you to do. I want you to rotate the circle. See, what he's thinking is that the man in Flatland, at least in his mind, can take the circle and go like this. And if you take a circle and go like this, what do you get? A sphere. But the man in Flatland takes a circle and he goes like that. And the sphere says, no, go the other way. So he goes like that, and the sphere says, no, go the third way. And the poor guy in Flatland says, you idiot, there is no third way. Because in Flatland there isn't, is there? See, up and down are like that to the sphere, but up and down are like that to the man in Flatland. It is completely and totally impossible for the man in Flatland to totally understand the true nature of the sphere. Now listen to this. The only thing the man in Flatland can understand is the way the sphere manifests itself to him in his own dimension. Now, why have I told you that little story this morning? And why did Edwin Abbott write it? Because, ladies and gentlemen, you are the man in Flatland. Except your Flatland's three-dimensional. And God is the sphere. Except God is however many spatial dimensions there are, plus one. See, I'm not not talking to you this week about a God that is made of gold or silver or stone, crafted by art and man's device. That's an ignorant position. It's also a quote of Acts 17, beginning with verse 22. I'm talking about a God that is so superior to us. A God that exists in such a higher dimension than do we. A God who, according to Genesis 1:1, in violation of all of our laws of science, touched our little flatland, so to speak, and created matter out of nothing. The message of Genesis 1:1 is what you see in my hands and what you see on the screen. You know what's interesting about that? The Bible has always portrayed God in that way. You ever notice the way the Bible defines God? The Bible says like God is love. The Bible says things like God is light. Jesus said God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Jesus said, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee. Flesh and blood didn't do it, but my Father who art in heaven. You can't read the Bible and come to the conclusion that God is an old man in the sky. The Bible says God is not a man. God is eternal. God is everlasting. God is the Word. God is unseen. Every definition of God, from Genesis to Revelation, is totally non-physical. Totally non-anthropomorphic. Nothing like man. But then you say, now wait. I know the Bible talks about the face of God. I know the Bible talks about the hand of God. That's true, but not when it defines God. That kind of language is used when the Bible is explaining how God interacts with us. We talk about the long arm of the law. What does that mean? You're going over the speed limit, the big hand comes out of the sky and picks you up out of your car? Well, that's silly, isn't it? We're talking about the way the law acts, aren't we? The consistency of the law. We're talking about the face of America. What are we talking about? Get up in an airplane, see a big face? No, we're talking about what the average American believes, what they value, what they think is important. When the Bible explains how God interacts with man, it may use accommodative language. But every time God is defined in Scripture, there are no human characteristics and there are no physical characteristics whatsoever. We struggle with that. Atheists struggle with it. In the last 25 years, however, science has proven multi-dimensions exist. String theory, brain theory, quantum mechanics. Nobody questions this anymore. Science has verified what the Bible has said from the beginning. What's interesting about that is that we all have dealt with this throughout time, and atheists are constantly plagued with it. You know, I was a pretty wild teacher in high school. And about this time of year, I used to have a little thing I did with the kids. I had a Superman cape. And I would go back in the prep room, and they all come in, and, you know, it's May, and they're tired, and they don't want to listen to that, you know. And so when the bell rings, I come flying into the room with my cape in the wind, and I land in front of them, I say, hey, you guys! It usually gets me one eye open, you know. What's he going to do this time? I said, I got a little deal I want to make with you. Going to give you a little diagnostic test. One question. If you get the question right, you don't have to come to class anymore. You don't have to do the homework anymore. You don't have to write the labs anymore. You don't have to do the term paper. You don't even have to take a final exam. You come in the last day of class, I'll give you your A. I don't have to see your face again. Now I got both eyes open, all over the room. But I'm not done. But if you get the question wrong, you're going to start out with an F in this class. You like to prove to me you're not as dumb as you look. Good deal? And they're all saying, oh, let me have it. I'm going for 1 hour off, get looped in the parking lot every day. I say, okay, here we go, one question. Essay! Then their eyes really light up. Woo-hoo! Essay! Yeah. Creative writing. Ah! I can bluff my way by any essay question. Okay, so here we go. Write it down. Define. They write down define. The word. They write down the word. Time. Tell me what time is. You got 10 minutes. They don't even catch that. You know, I did that for 41 years. I had one student turn in an essay, Amy Hahn. I'm still going back and forth with her. Amy wrote in her paper, she said, if you go 100 miles at 50 miles an hour, that's 2 hours. That's time. That's not a definition, is it? That's an equivalence. That's like saying 100 pennies equals $1. It tells you what it's equal to. It doesn't tell you what it is. See, you can't tell me what time is. It is not possible for you to tell me the meaning of the word time. Atheists say to me, I don't believe in God. I can't see Him. I can't smell Him. I can't taste Him. I can't feel Him. I won't believe in anything unless I can perceive it through my senses. And my response is, oh, really? You believe in time? You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it, you can't hear it. You believe in time? One of the debate things that I mentioned earlier is with Neil Rogers. You heard of Neil Rogers? The guy on the talk show in Miami calls himself a homosexual Jewish atheist. When I had my debate with Neil Rogers, I used this on him. You know what he said? He said, oh, that's different. I can see the effects of time. And my response is, man, if you can't see the effects of God, you have not been looking. You have not been looking. That's a cop-out. That's an intellectual cop-out. To say you won't believe in something unless you can perceive it through your senses is the laziest thing I can imagine. Because we have a bazillion things that we do not perceive through our senses, and yet we believe in them very emphatically. Do you realize, for example, we've never seen an atom? Nobody's ever seen an atom, not a single atom. We've never smelled one, we've never tasted one, we've never heard one. In no way have we perceived a single atom through our senses, but we built an atomic bomb. We've never seen an electron. Nobody's ever taken a single electron, held it up, looked at it, smelled it, tasted it, heard it, felt it, in any way perceived it through our senses. But we have computers that occasionally work and wonderful other technology devices based upon what we think an electron is all about. We've never seen a photon. We've never felt one. But we have lasers that do incredible things based upon what we think a photon is about. And the list goes on and on. Neutrinos, quarks. How do we do that stuff? Well, let me take one you all know. Somewhere back in your educational experience, you were convinced about a thing called an electron, and it started in the 3rd grade. You had a 3rd grade teacher who showed you that if you take a dead cat and rub it on a plastic comb, the plastic comb will pick up little bits of paper. Remember that? Yeah. 3rd grade. Then you got into high school and in chemistry class. You learned that an electron has a mass that is 1/1837th the mass of a proton. That's a 10th grade lab now. I had it as a graduate student. And then you took the most wonderful class you ever took, physics, and you learned that an electron spins clockwise in the magnetic field, and everything we know of electrons. That gives us television sets and microwave ovens and computers and all the wonderful things that are part of our technological world. We have, because we have understood those things through their properties. In science, we have learned that when you have something you cannot observe through your senses, the way you understand that something is through its properties. Okay, folks, tell me something. What are these? They're properties, yeah. They're properties of God. The Bible is just doing what science has learned to do in recent years. To understand an entity, God, that does not lend itself to empirical observation through our senses by describing God's properties. This is just good science. And every problem we have with God, we have because we don't think and use the tools that are available to us. You know, when I was an atheist, I had a little lecture I used to give as an atheist called The Stupidity of God. I started out quoting 2 Peter 3 and verse 8. You know the passage. And as an atheist, I would say, boy, you talk about stupid. Everybody knows that's not the way time is. Everybody knows time is the one ethereal substance. You can't speed it up. You can't slow it down. It's the one thing that's the same for everybody. Then I took my first course in nuclear physics. And then we studied in that class Albert Einstein's theory of special relativity. Now, if you hadn't had any algebra, you might want to take a 2-minute nap. We'll be right back. But for the benefit of those who have, let me point something out. This is a proven equation. V is the velocity at which you move, c is the speed of light. If your velocity v gets near the speed of light c, then that fraction gets bigger than 1. And it's 1 minus almost 1, so the value of the fraction becomes infinitely large. Time dilates, it changes. Okay, non-algebra students. I got 2 twins, 10 years old. I'm going to take one twin, put him in a spaceship. Send him out to the nearest star, traveling at the speed of light. That's Alpha Centauri Proxima. It's 4.3 light years out in space. He travels for 4.5 years by our time here upon the Earth to the nearest star, Alpha Centauri Proxima. He gets up there, he takes a few pictures, he eats his lunch, he turns around, he comes back. He travels for another 4 years by our watch here on the Earth. He has been gone 8 years by our watch here on the Earth. His twin brother is now 18 years old. The spaceship lands. The young man steps out, who was 10 years old when he left 8 years ago. And guess what? He's still 10 years old. They were the same age when he left, and he's 8 years younger when he gets back. And you say, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a proven fact. We have a spaceship that just left the solar system called Pioneer. When it left in 1977, it had a clock on board that was synchronized with clocks on the Earth. The clock on board the spaceship has slowed down, and the amount it has slowed down is exactly what that equation says it should have. So time is not an ethereal substance. Time is not the same for everything. Time is what the Bible says it is. Time is a created thing by God, and it is relative. Now, atheists say, when I do this, they say, well, that's just a happy coincidence. All right, let's see. Let's see. Because Einstein gave us another tool to use. It's called the principle of equivalence. It says time and space are not different things, they're just different ways of measuring the same thing. Let me show you how easy that is. Suppose I come to this gentleman and say, how far is it to Omaha? What would you say? 100 miles. I come to this gentleman and I say, how far is it to Omaha? He says, with me driving, 1 hour. You're still doing it, huh? Who's right? Well, they both are, aren't they? He measured it in space, he measured it in time. They're just different ways of measuring the same thing. Now, before you get to thinking this is trivial, let me show you something. Suppose I could pull out a magic wand and wave it somehow and stop time. But suppose you could function as God does. Suppose you could function normally. Think what you could do. You could go out and get in your car and drive to Los Angeles, and you would be here, and you'd be in Los Angeles, and you'd be both places. Now, if I could stop time. Or you could go to Washington, D.C., and you'd be here, and you'd be in L.A., and you'd be in Washington, you'd be all 3 places. Now, if I could stop time. Or you could go to the moon. You wouldn't have to breathe or feel pressure. You could be everywhere in all places now if I could just stop time. I didn't tell you that. You've said that. You've said it 1,000 times. How many times have you said, if only I had time, I would do? It's hard to believe they gave Einstein all that recognition for something so simple. Especially when you realize the Bible had already stated it. Look at Jeremiah 23:23, for example. God says, am I a God near at hand and not a God afar off, saith the Lord? Do I not fill heaven and earth, saith the Lord? What's he saying? He's saying God is here. He's in Los Angeles. He's in Washington, D.C., believe it or not. He fills all of space now. And Einstein says, yes, yes. A God unlimited in time has to be unlimited in space, because time and space are inseparably linked. It would have been so easy for the biblical writers to have messed this up, and they did not make one single solitary mistake. Folks, you can believe everything the Bible says. One of my favorite passages in the Bible is Acts 17. Beginning with verse 22, remember the passage? Paul is talking to the educated elite of his day, the real eggheads in the city of Athens. Remember I started that out? Men of Athens, I perceive in all things you're too superstitious. These are the highbrows. They didn't think they were superstitious. Later on, he told them they were ignorant. Made a lot of friends that day. And then Paul talked about what Paul called the unknown God. The same God that is unknown in America today. And do you remember how he described that God? He said, God is a God in whom we live and move and have our being. Now, is that your concept of God? I'm not asking if you believe in God. That's irrelevant. Is the God you believe in or don't believe in, as the case may be, a God in whom you live and move and have your being? The problems we have because we don't understand the nature of God. When somebody says, what color of skin does God have? What's their concept of God? Yeah, the racial, ethnic old man in the sky. This is a huge issue when I talk to predominantly black congregations. Listen, God does not possess skin color. We're not talking a white man's God. We're not talking a black man's God. God is a spirit. What's your concept? What sex is God? One of the books that's downstairs is called Looking Back. It's the story of the first 40 years of our ministry. There's a whole chapter there in the University of California at Berkeley. Every time I was at Berkeley, I had a wild time. It was fun. But the first time I was there was one of my favorites. I was speaking in Lawrence Auditorium, the big science auditorium on campus. We had 1,200 students there. And it's one of those auditoriums that slopes up and it's got aisles coming down. And I was doing a two-part thing, so I was up in the front getting my stuff together, and I looked up and here comes a young lady walking, co-ed, walking down the aisle. She's wearing a trench coat, and she's followed by an entourage of giggling friends. I knew something was coming. Just didn't have any idea what it was. And she came up to me and she said, Mr. Clayton, she said, I'm going to go to heaven. I said, really? I'm glad to hear that. How do you plan to accomplish that? And she took off her raincoat and dropped it on the ground. She was totally and completely nude. And she said, I'm going to seduce God. And I made one of those hip shot reactions. It's normally not a good idea. Actually, I thought this one turned out pretty good, though. I looked at her and said, man, I said, I'm sorry, but you don't have the right equipment. And I thought about what I said, but that's a pretty good answer. You don't seduce God. God is not a male with male arrogance, with male insecurity, with all the baggage that goes with the male gender. There is no neuter in the Hebrew language. Did you know that? There is no neuter in Hebrew. So if a sexual identity is going to be given to God, it has to be done contextually. And sometimes in the Bible, the context is feminine. Let me give you one you all know. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, which kills the prophets and stones them who are sent unto thee. How often would I have gathered thy children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and thou wouldst not, with tears. Tell me that's a male image. God is not a sexual being. You don't seduce God. When it's violence and war and all that stuff, it's male. And many times, it's female. When somebody says, how can God hear my prayer and the prayer of the little boy in China at the same time? Listen, listen. God has all of eternity to listen to every last split-second prayer of every one of those poor souls on those airplanes as they slammed into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and that field in Pennsylvania. Every prayer you ever prayed is now to God. God listens to your prayers for eternity. Speaking of eternity, what is it? Heard a man say one time, eternity is how long it take an ant to move Mount Everest from LA to New York. No, not eternity. Had a young lady tell me eternity was my second-hour physics class. Yeah, I've had a few of those. It's bad. I hope it's not that bad. Listen, listen. Eternity is that situation where time does not exist. Now think. If time doesn't exist, what else won't exist? Space, yeah, that's why they got the nothing bit that we talked about. What else won't exist? Well, there will be no death in eternity. Why not? Because death is dependent upon the passage of time. If I could stop time right now, you would never die. There will be no pain in eternity. Why not? Because pain is dependent upon the time it takes for the signal to get from what gets hurt to what registers what gets hurt. I have a son who has muscular dystrophy. You know how they check on the progression of the disease? They put a shock in his foot, an electrical shock, and they measure how long it takes the pain sensation to go through his nervous system and register in his brain on an electroencephalogram. By comparing the time now to the time 10 years ago, they can tell the rate at which the MD is progressing. If time stopped, would the signal ever get to his brain? No physical pain in eternity. Now there's other kinds of pain, that's what hell's about. But not pain based on nerve endings and brain tissue. No more tears. No more crying. Why not? Because these things are all based upon time, and if you're tracking me right now, you surely realize that I just gave you a verbatim quote of Revelation 21 verse 4, which tells us what it will be like to be in heaven. A timeless condition, free of every miserable constraint that time brings upon us. And when someone says, who created God? Where did God come from? Once again, they're demonstrating they do not have the slightest idea of what God is. Let me tell you what you do. Next time somebody asks you who created God, hand them a sheet of paper, hand them a pencil, and say, here, would you please draw me a four-sided triangle? Draw me a four-sided triangle, please. Now, of course, what they're going to say to you is, well, I can't do it because your question was wrong. And you say, yeah, and so was yours. Now, follow me here. When you say who created God, you made an assumption. You made the assumption that there was a time when there was no God. Okay? Follow that. When you say who created God, you made the assumption there was a time when there was no God. But God began the beginning. God created time. That's how we read, before time was, I am, saith the Lord. That's why we read, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Over and over, the Bible talks about things that existed before the creation. And also things that will happen after. Now, if you've ever said, well, God has always been, that's okay. What's your frame of reference? Us. Us. But when somebody says, who created God? They don't understand the nature of God. God created time. God created space. The modern proponents of the Big Bang are saying that at some singularity, time and space were created. That's verbatim right out of the textbook. The one thing they will not do is tell you who did it. They talk about it banging. They don't tell you what banged or who banged it. And we know the answer to that one. Draw me a four-sided triangle. Now, I know I dumped the whole truck on you this morning. I do think you need to understand we have some handouts down there that go through this. The Flatland thing is in a little booklet on our handout table. Some of you probably already got it. I hope you picked one up. It's called A Help in Understanding What God Is. It has the bibliographical references to Flatland. And there's another little booklet which goes through this last question. But I want to do one more thing. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he them, male and female created he them, and called their name Adam. What's that mean? Well, let me show you something it doesn't mean. Here is a picture that has been created in my image. And here is another picture that has been created in my image. Both pictures were created in my image. So what's true of the two pictures? Well, they look pretty much alike, don't they? I can say, yeah, double ugly. Okay. Why do they look so much alike? Because they were created in the image of the same thing, right? That's what it means to say something is in the image of something else. It looks like the thing it's in the image of. Now think. Think, 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 think. If I am in the image of God, and if you are in the image of God, and if that is a physical image of a physical God, what would have to be true of you and me? We would be identical twins, but you don't look like me. You're not bald and fat and ugly. Why not? Well, some of you are. At least one out of the three. But the point is, we're not identical twins. Not physically. So the answer to this comes by looking carefully at the definition of God. In Genesis, the word Elohim is used exclusively for God. It conveys the power and the strength and the majesty of God. Yahweh, on the other hand, emphasizes the promises of God. Adonai emphasizes the ruler aspect of God. But there is a singular concept of God. It's not used in Genesis, not until you get over to the 14th chapter. So Elohim is the word in Genesis 1. And it's a plural word. And that pluralness is carried all the way through Scripture. Let us create man in our image. Plural. Who's he talking to? We understand in the New Testament. We read things like, go ye therefore, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Plural. And we're not saying three gods. What we're talking about is the nature of God and the nature of us in God's image. Let's follow that for a minute. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We possess something which we call intellect. Now that's not intelligence. You can accuse me of being unintelligent, but you cannot accuse me of not having intellect. Intellect is that capacity of man which enables man to function without the benefit of instinct. An animal reacts to the here and now. They don't worry about the past. They don't get bent out of shape about the future. They deal with the immediate situation. You want to get a psychologist in an argument? Ask him how many instincts man is born with in the presence of another psychologist. I just almost guarantee an argument. The problem is we don't have a good definition. But what's important to understand is there are things man does that are clearly not instinctive. Because man doesn't respond as just an animal. Let me shortcut here. We're going to run out of time in this discussion. If I can get this to move forward. There we go. About 5 years ago, there were some young men walking in a field in France. They saw steam coming out of the ground. If you've lived in a karst topography, as I have, you know what that means. There's a cave down there. So they went, got some lights, went down the cave, turned on the lights. That's what they saw. A little further down. A little further down. Come on, computer, move. There we go. You know, Picasso went into the Cro-Magnon caves and said, we have learned nothing about art in our entire history. The earliest artwork show everything you learned in art appreciation class. Structure, abstraction, form, all that stuff. Beautiful. And they're pretty good technically, too. These guys got paintings to stay on the walls of wet caves for thousands of years. I can't get paint to stay in my house 6 months. This is no dummy. This is a highly advanced individual that created beautiful works of art. You know what happens when you give a crayon or a paintbrush to a chimpanzee? He eats it. He doesn't sit down and express himself artistically. What is it in man that gives him this ability? What is it in man that has caused him from his earliest days to express himself in music? Have you ever heard of a chimpanzee writing a protest song? What is it in man that has caused him from his earliest days to express himself in worship? Why does man worship God anyway? Now you ask the atheist this and they'll say, well, that's because we're so smart. That's because we have such a large brain. That's because our brain is so well organized. I'm sorry. I can blow a 40-foot hole in that argument right off the bat. I have a mentally retarded son at home by the name of Tim. Here's a picture. Tim, he's 3 years old. My son Tim has a Stanford Binet IQ of 42. Badly mentally challenged. But you know, if you visit our home, and if Tim's there, you'll hear him leading us in prayer at the dinner table. He has led 3 people to Christ that I know of. Don't tell me about having to be smart to radiate Christ. You give Tim some time and you hear him singing. He makes up his own songs, making up his own lyrics. You learn early who the bad guys are, who the good guys are in the last 24 hours. You give Tim a crayon and a piece of paper, he'd draw you a beautiful picture. Here's a picture he drew when he was... We'll get to Coco in a minute. Here's a picture he drew when he was 16 years old, before he lost his vision. Hey, you know, it's not too hot for a 16-year-old kid, but I think you can make out the apple tree, the flowers, the rabbit, the neighbor's cat, hopefully not to scale. But you can recognize it. Now, in 1976, there was an article in the National Geographic about a gorilla by the name of Coco, trained at Stanford University. On the Stanford Binet IQ test, that Tim scores a 42 on, this gorilla scores a 95. So he's a very intelligent animal. Intelligence is not peculiar to humans. But you know what's interesting about that? They have desperately tried to show these characteristics in Coco. One of my favorite stories, Penny Patterson, who's the trainer of this gorilla, came into the gorilla's cage with a canvas and with some paintbrushes and showed the gorilla how to mark the canvas with the paintbrush. She put a canvas in front of the gorilla, gave him a yellow paintbrush, and he copied what he had seen her do. The gorilla speaks the sign language of the deaf. So she signed banana to the gorilla in the sign language of the deaf, and the gorilla signed banana back. 3 weeks later, she went into the gorilla's cage, held up the canvas, and the gorilla pointed to the canvas and signed banana. Oh, well, good. That proves the gorilla's artistic, right? Well, here's the problem. When somebody walked into the cage wearing the yellow smile button, the gorilla points to the smile button and signs banana. When someone walks in wearing a yellow hat, he points to the hat and signs banana. When someone wears in wearing a yellow tie, he points to the tie and signs banana. And they had an article in National Geographic 2 years ago about a yellow kitten given to the gorilla. What would you guess the gorilla signed when he saw the yellow kitten? I did a youth rally not long ago. A kid in the back jumped up and yelled, "Lunch!" No, not lunch. Banana. This is good old Pavlovian conditioning. The gorilla is related to the color. What is it in man that gives him the capacity to express himself in art? Humans we have written off as vegetables do these things, Smart animals do not. And it's important to understand that this shows up in a completely different area. Suppose you get home from this trip and you find out that your dog has chewed up your favorite pair of slippers. And you roll up a newspaper and you raise it above your head and you are confronted with this. You going to hit that? Now what's going on here? Is this dog overwhelmed with some compelling sense of guilt? He's learned you don't hit him so hard if he looks pathetic enough. That's a conditioned response. Your dog doesn't feel guilty when he bites the postman. He doesn't have any sympathy for the cat that runs up a tree next door for the 35th time. Animals do not have the capacity for forgiveness that Jesus Christ demonstrated on the cross. You see, we are identical twins, spiritually. We are identical twins, spiritually. And we refer to that part of us that is created and in God's image as our soul. The soul is not some physical apparition that floats out of your body when you die. The soul is that part of you created in the image of God, which gives you the capacity to worship, to have an agape type of love, to sing, to create art, to feel guilt, to be sympathetic. Do you understand how important this is? You see, if I really believe this, then I'm forced to believe you are of value. I don't care who you are. I don't care about your race. I don't care about your sex. I don't care about your IQ. I don't care about your money. I don't care about your education. I don't even care what you've done. You are the most important thing on this earth. Because you are uniquely and specially created in the image of God. That gives you intrinsic, inherent worth. But there's another definition out there which our world has bought into. And I'm having to skip some stuff here because we're almost out of time. Where does this definition come from? First of all, it assumes that man is an animal and nothing else. Then it gives a list of physical criteria. And I don't have time to explain all these. Let me just real quick show you a couple. The position of the sagittal crest. The opening into the skull called the foramen magnum. Where it is located. The question of the shape of the jaw. The question of the arrangement of the teeth. The question of the shape of the cusp between the teeth. Which leads to charts like this. In which everybody in the chart is called early man. Because everybody in the chart has at least one of the 15 criteria I just had on the screen. It's a completely different criteria. I didn't say it's wrong. It's just a completely different criteria. And if you're going to define man physically, that's one thing. But when you start extrapolating that, then you run into trouble. And especially when you see things like this. Let me conclude by telling you a teacher story that I hope will drive this point home. I started teaching in a ghetto high school in 1959. One of the things that I realized right away was that there were a lot of kids from the inner city that just needed tutoring. Nobody would sit down and help them when they got stuck on something. So I started a tutorial program at 6 o'clock in the morning in my room. Anybody in the school could come and be tutored by me. If there was math, science, they were in pretty good shape. If it was in English, they were in trouble. But I tutored. Did that for 41 years. Most rewarding thing I ever did in my life. One morning right before Christmas, I came to school. I didn't expect anybody to be there. It's right before Christmas. But I came anyway. When I got to my room, the door was unlocked. I thought, that's weird. And we're not supposed to go into an unlocked room because we had gang warfare going on. 8 kids shot and killed in the neighborhood of the school that year. But it's 6 o'clock. Custodian service doesn't come out to 7:30. I'm not standing there for an hour and a half. I opened the door and went in. And there's a young lady sitting in the first lab station. One of my students. I looked at her and I found myself staring down the barrel of a .45 caliber revolver. Her name was Heather. But before I could even blink, she said, "Don't worry, Mr. C, this is not for you." And she turned the gun around and put it in her mouth. Well, we're trained in what you're supposed to do in this situation. So I did what the book says. I stepped back and I said, "Heather, wait a minute, wait. I said, "Heather, I don't understand. What's going on?" She lowered the gun. She said, "I'm nothing special. I'm sick of being used. I'm sick of being abused. I don't want to be in a world like this anymore. I want out of here, and nothing you can say is going to change my mind." She put the gun back in her mouth. I said, "Heather, wait a minute, I don't understand." I said, "Heather, you're a beautiful girl. You're gorgeous." I said, "Heather, you got a good mind. You're in my AP physics class. You're doing good work." I said, I've never heard anybody say anything bad about you. What in the world are you talking about?" She lowered the gun. She says, "All right, I'll tell you what I'm talking about." She says, "You know what happened in August? My mom and dad got divorced." I said, "Oh, yeah, Heather, but lots of kids." Because she waved me off. She said, "When I came home last night, my mother's boyfriend raped me." I said, "Oh, man. Oh, Heather, that's just awful." But Heather, she waved me off again. So I ran to my dad, said, "You know what he did to me?" And she turned her head, and the whole left side of her face was smashed from her father's fist. I said, "Dad," he says, "it's my fault. I don't want to live in a world like this. I don't want to be here anymore. I want out of here." And she put the gun back in her hand. And I dropped to my knees, and I said, "Heather, listen to me." I said, "Heather, you've just gone through the worst experience, the most horrible experience any human being can endure. And you are in no condition to make a decision right now about life and death. But I want you to hear this, Heather. You're beautiful." "No, I'm not." "You're beautiful." "No, I'm not." "You're beautiful." "Look at me." "No, I'm not." "You're beautiful because you're created in the image of God. You have a soul that can live forever." I said, "Heather, maybe something good can come out of this. Maybe this will help you find God. Maybe this will help you find a career." I said, "Heather, I can't justify what's happened to you, but you're in no condition to choose to die right now. I love you because I'm a Christian. I want you to know that you're special because you're in the image of God. You are special." And we sat there for what seemed like an eternity, and she finally handed me the gun. A year and a half later, I watched her graduate from high school. In that time, she became a Christian. She's going to a state university not far from here. She just got her doctorate. She is majoring in psychology and psychiatry, and her specialty is battered and abused women and children. Mm-hmm. I'm here to say to you, this is not a fun and games battle of semantics we're talking about here today, folks. This is something our world has desperately got to hear. Human life is precious. We are in a battle, not only for the lives of men and women and boys and girls, but for their eternal destiny. You're special. You're special, young person. You're special, young wife. You're special, divorced person. You're special, convicted rapist. You're special because you're created in the image of God, and that gives you value. Would you bow with me in a closing prayer? Father, it's so hard for us to understand your nature. We know that our thoughts are not your thoughts. Your thoughts are beyond our thoughts. We know our nature is so inferior to you. We know you created us. You built into us a part of your nature, which gives us the capacity to make a difference in this world. We're thankful for this college. We're thankful for the people who have come here this week, not only to enjoy each other, to enjoy good food, to see some of the things our culture has done, but also to encourage each other to be motivated to do more, to reach out, and to change the world around us. To somehow convince our young that they have value, to somehow convince our home congregations that it's not just plain church, it's not a social club, it's life and death. It's eternity in hell or eternity with you. Father, help us to take it seriously. Help us to somehow find the words and the way to convey it to our folks at home. Dismiss us now, Father, as we learn more about the Romans, and be with Tim as he teaches us. Help us to grow in that understanding. Dismiss us from this class now in your loving care. In Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.